the launch of the SpaceX Dragon mission that took place earlier this week. And NASA has provided an update with some really cool information about the experiments that are going to be performed on board the International Space Station by the Crew 4 astronauts. One experiment is particularly interesting. It's all about DNA repair mechanisms. And this is important because we're trying to understand what happens to our bodies when we go into space for long periods of time. What effect does weightlessness have on our bodies? But also, we're looking further ahead to sending astronauts on the Artemis missions to the moon, and eventually perhaps even sending people to Mars. So this research is really critical, and NASA have given us a bit more information about how they're going to perform this experiment. So let's get into that. But first of all, if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing. I try to make videos about twice a week, usually Wednesday and Saturday. And what I would love is for you guys to come along for the ride and join the community. You can watch the videos, and if you enjoy them, hit that subscribe button. You can also check out my new channel, which I made with a friend. We basically just talk about everything up there and everything down here, current events and space exploration. So if you want to check that out, that's great too. So the 4 astronauts who launched on the SpaceX Dragon capsule named Endurance are all very experienced astronauts. They include NASA astronaut Cheryl Lindgren, Robert Hines, a NASA astronaut and the commander of the mission, Samantha Cristoforetti, an astronaut from the European Space Agency and also a cosmonaut from the Russian Space Agency. They launched successfully on April, and they will spend several months on board the International Space Station where they'll be performing science experiments. One of the major investigations that they will be involved in is called the One More Space Investigation. This is all about looking at how the human body adapts to being in space. There are a number of different projects within this investigation. The one that I thought was particularly interesting was the DNA repair project. So here's what NASA has said about this particular experiment. Cells continuously accumulate DNA damages from exposure to agents such as ultraviolet radiation, ionizing radiation, and certain chemicals. Normally, cells repair this damage to maintain genomic stability. However, in space, the mechanisms underlying DNA repair are altered and become less efficient, leading to the accumulation of unrepaired DNA lesions. In space, it has been observed that the rate of DNA damage in human cells increases significantly. UV radiation is thought to be one of the main contributors to DNA damage in space. UV radiation is present both on Earth and in space. However, in space, the levels of UV radiation can be much higher than on Earth due to the lack of atmosphere to filter it. Ionizing radiation is another major concern. In space, ionizing radiation comes mainly from galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events. These particles can interact with atoms in the human body, knocking electrons away from molecules and causing them to become ions. These ions can then react with other molecules, damaging DNA and other cellular components. Now, the International Space Station flies through a Van Allen belt of high-energy protons and neutrons every time it passes through the Earth's atmosphere. This belt of radiation was discovered back in 1958, and it's named after the guy who discovered it, James Van Allen. And it's split into 2 separate regions, the inner and outer Van Allen belts. The inner belt contains high-energy protons, and the outer belt contains high-energy electrons. Now, the intensity of these belts can vary a lot depending on solar activity. When the sun is active, it ejects plasma and magnetic fields into space, and that can disturb the Van Allen belts, altering their intensity. To understand the impact of these radiation belts on the human body, NASA have built a device called the Spaceborne United States Miniaturized Radiation and Environment Experimental System, or, SURF. And they've sent that to the International Space Station to help answer questions related to crew health and safety. It was sent to the station in the SpaceX Dragon cargo craft back in December 2021. It's actually sat on the space station since then, waiting for the right crew to come along to operate it. And now the Dragon mission astronauts are going to start operating this equipment. So the device has 3 key elements to it: There's a biological experiment module, there's a dosimeter, and there's a radiation monitor. Now, the biological experiment module contains various cell cultures that can be exposed to radiation to study the effects. It has sample ports where different types of cells can be loaded into the device. There are 3 of these sample ports. Port A is designed for human cells, and ports B and C are for plant cells. Port B can be exposed to low doses of radiation, while port C can be exposed to high doses of radiation. The cells in these ports can be kept either at normal room temperature or at a lower temperature, which simulates storage in a spacecraft freezer. Now, each sample port has a light port and a magnetic stirrer to mix things up a little bit. Port A also has a gas inlet port to introduce gases like oxygen or other gases into the system. The second part is the dosimeter, and this is used to measure the radiation dose that the cells receive during the experiment. There are 2 types of dosimeters inside SURF. One type uses thermoluminescent dosimeters, which are solid-state devices that trap energy when exposed to radiation. And the other dosimeters use optically stimulated luminescence, which are similar to TLDS, but they respond to visible light rather than X-rays. The third part is the radiation monitor, and this is used to monitor the radiation environment around the space station. It contains Geiger-Müller detectors to measure the amount of radiation coming from outside the space station, and it can also identify different types of radiation particles based on their energy and charge. So NASA says that the aim of the SURF experiment is to quantify the effects of the space radiation on the human body. This will be done by irradiating human cells with known doses of radiation in space, and then analyzing the cells to understand how they have been affected. The cells will be analyzed for things like cell viability, changes in gene expression, and mutations. The idea is that by understanding how cells are affected by radiation in space, researchers can develop strategies to mitigate the risks of space travel. This could involve things like giving astronauts medications before they go into space to protect them against radiation, developing new technologies to shield astronauts from radiation, or developing new countermeasures to help astronauts recover from the effects of radiation once they return to Earth. This is really exciting stuff. And it's one of those things that is so vital to do because we want to send humans to Mars, and the radiation that they would face on that journey would be huge compared to what we experience here on Earth. So it's really important to understand how we can protect the crew on such journeys. The expected duration of the SURF experiment is 6 months. That's the length of the typical mission for astronauts on the International Space Station. However, the data collected in this experiment will be analyzed for up to a year after the experiment is completed. I hope you found that interesting. If you did, please remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.